The pleasure principle urges the psyche to seek immediate comfort, ease, and gratification, while the reality principle demands adaptation to external demands, responsibilities, and constraints. In everyday life, these forces wage an invisible battle as individuals strive to balance rest and effort. The pleasure principle whispers to postpone an arduous report until a soothing break, enticing with the lure of a favorite pastime. The reality principle, by contrast, insists that deadlines and obligations cannot wait, requiring discipline to confront discomfort for long-term gain. This tension unfolds in the mind as a dynamic tug-of-war. When duties mount, email inboxes swell, meetings loom, projects stack. Repeated exposure to stress activates the ego's rigid alignment with the reality principle. The ego rallies resources to push through fatigue, sacrificing leisure for productivity. Yet the pleasure principle persists, seeping in through exhaustion-driven urges, a longing for rest, an impulse to distract, the craving for leisure that momentarily soothes mounting pressure. When the pleasure principle's voice grows too strong, boundaries erode, and one opts for short-term relief over sustained action, setting the stage for imbalance. Freud depicted the reality principle as the ego's evolution beyond infantile demands, shaping behavior through deferred gratification and strategic planning. In an ideal scenario, the ego integrates both principles, satisfying instinctual needs at appropriate times while meeting life's responsibilities. Yet when reality overwhelms, when responsibilities become relentless, the pleasure principle can lose nuance, shifting into impulsive escapes or compulsive distractions that undermine performance. What begins as a necessary reprieve morphs into habitual avoidance, and the mind's architecture tilts dangerously toward chronic stress and eventual burnout. Professional environments intensify this clash. Organizations valorize sustained output, praising those who sacrifice personal time for work. This external reinforcement bolsters the reality principle, urging individuals to eschew rest in service of achievement. Yet biological limits persist, cognitive resources deplete, emotional reserves drain, and physical systems falter. The pleasure principle then reacts emphatically, demanding restoration through any available means. A late-night worker may resist sleep until performance falters so severely that the mind forcibly shuts down, an extreme example of unheeded pleasure principle eruption. Understanding this turbulent interplay clarifies why some people overwork to the point of collapse. Their ego, overly swayed by the reality principle, neglects self-care signals until compensatory pleasures, social media, screen time, comfort food, usurp time meant for recovery. Conversely, those who prioritize pleasure without sufficient regard for responsibilities slip into procrastination and reactive panic. The healthiest balance emerges when the ego negotiates a compromise, scheduling rigorous work intervals punctuated by restorative breaks that genuinely satisfy the pleasure principle without derailing progress. Practically, renegotiating this balance begins with mapping one's instinctual cues. A simple strategy is to track moments of intense fatigue or distraction. When the urge to snack, scroll, or nap becomes irresistible during work, each signal marks a plea from the pleasure principle, revealing where reality demands have outpaced internal resources. By noting these episodes, individuals learn patterns of stress accumulation and can preemptively intersperse small restorative rituals, 5-minute mindfulness, brief walks, hydration pauses, before collapse becomes inevitable. Another method is temporary pleasure scheduling. Rather than succumbing to impulsive gratification when stress peaks, one allocates deliberate periods for comfort aligned with productivity cycles. For instance, after a 50-minute focus session, 6 minutes are reserved for a pleasurable activity of choice. This structured approach honors the pleasure principle on its own terms, while reinforcing the reality principle's requirement for progress. Over time, the mind internalizes this balanced rhythm, reducing the power of unplanned escapes and fostering sustainable work habits. Finally, reframing rest as a component of efficiency transforms the narrative. When rest is seen not as indulgence but as a vital performance enhancer, the reality principle itself sanctions pleasure principle needs. Recognizing that the brain's capacity for deep cognitive work resets more effectively after adequate breaks encourages integration of both forces. Reframing sleep, leisure, and enjoyment as essential to meeting responsibilities empowers the ego to negotiate with both principles rather than bow exclusively to one. By portraying the pleasure principle and reality principle as complementary rather than adversarial, individuals can cultivate a resilient mindset. This mindset acknowledges that pleasure principle needs are not obstacles but signals requiring respect, and that reality principle demands, while essential, must be tempered by restoration. In this ongoing dialogue, the ego learns to mediate effectively, weaving together comfort and discipline into a sustainable pattern. Achieving this delicate balance lays the groundwork for preventing burnout and maintaining long-term vitality. Under the guise of dedication, relentless duty morphs into a silent prison, sapping vitality and bending life's rhythm toward unrelenting toil. What begins as a sense of purpose, taking on more tasks, outperforming peers, shouldering extra responsibilities, slowly erodes the boundaries between work and self. Calls and emails spill into evenings, weekends blur into weekdays, and the pleasure principles pleas for relief are drowned out by an ever louder reality principle compulsion. There is always more to do. This toxic mutation of duty stems from an unconscious equation. Self-worth equals productivity. Each completed project raises the bar for the next, fueling a feedback loop of high achievement followed by deeper obligation. Even well-intentioned praise reinforces this cycle, as accolades for commitment validate overwork. Soon, rest feels like dereliction rather than recovery, and the individual remains trapped in a cycle of perpetual motion, afraid that pausing will unleash feelings of failure, inadequacy, or loss of identity. The psyche's adaptation to this snare involves defense mechanisms that further entrench the prison. Sublimation, once a healthy outlet for instinctual drives, becomes distorted into non-stop work. The ego redirects longing for pleasure into accomplishment, but without balance, achievement loses savor and becomes another duty to fulfill. Denial shields the mind from exhaustion by insisting, "I'm fine," despite cognitive fog, emotional numbness, and physical fatigue. Rationalization justifies skipping breaks. "I'll sleep when the project is done," while projection externalizes guilt onto others, blaming colleagues or circumstances for any slowdown. Physiologically, the body responds to chronic duty overload with heightened stress responses. Elevated cortisol disrupts sleep, impairs immune function, and intensifies anxiety. Adrenaline surges sustain hyperfocus but eventually crash, leaving the individual drained. Over time, muscle tension, headaches, and gastrointestinal distress emerge as somatic echoes of unrelenting mental strain. The body's alarm signals, insomnia, irritability, lowered resilience, are often ignored until breakdown becomes inevitable. This hidden death spiral operates because the reality principle, unchecked, demands more effort without respect for the pleasure principle's needs. Every deadline missed or goal postponed triggers harsh self-criticism. "I should be doing more." The inner critic, bolstered by past achievements, tightens its grip, ensuring that even leisure becomes tinged with guilt. Weekends stretch into catch-up work sessions. Vacations are hijacked by work emails, and personal relationships suffer as time once reserved for loved ones dwindles. Escaping this snare requires disrupting the unconscious link between worth and work. First, one must recognize that duty without boundaries is a distorted reality principle, a voice urging endless sacrifice at the cost of well-being. Not all responsibilities carry equal weight. Some can be delegated, delayed, or even declined without catastrophic consequences. Creating a duty inventory clarifies which obligations genuinely require immediate attention and which serve only the ego's need for validation. Next, reinstating the pleasure principle as a legitimate authority begins with small, non-negotiable rituals of restoration. These might include a daily period of genuine leisure, reading fiction, taking a mindful walk, enjoying a hobby, enforced with the same rigor once reserved for work tasks. Labeling these rituals as critical productivity boosters leverages the reality principle to protect pleasure time, reframing rest as essential maintenance rather than luxury. Boundary setting extends to communication with others. Clear work-life agreements with supervisors and colleagues. After 6 p.m., "I am unavailable except for emergencies," signal that rest is non-negotiable. This assertion honors both personal limits and professional commitments, aligning collaborative expectations with sustainable pacing. When others respect these boundaries, the duty snare loosens, allowing the ego to enforce balanced rhythms. Mindfulness practices support this transition by heightening awareness of duty's pull. Simple checks, pausing to notice tension and fatigue before automatic work resumption, create opportunities to choose restorative action. Logging stress and pleasure responses in a journal uncovers patterns of overcommitment and highlights activities that genuinely replenish energy rather than merely distract from work. Finally, reframing duty through a long-term lens counters the death spiral. Viewing rest as an integral part of career sustainability rather than temporary weakness shifts the narrative. Recharging becomes strategic investment, not indulgent withdrawal. Envisioning a future where balanced productivity replaces compulsive hustle reorients the ego, aligning efforts with enduring fulfillment rather than short-term achievement bursts. In this rebalanced model, duty remains a source of purpose, but no longer an unyielding master. The mind's dialogue evolves. I honor my responsibilities and also honor my need to recover. As the pleasure principle regains voice and the reality principle adopts tempered demands, the hidden trap of overwork dissolves, making space for sustainable energy, creativity, and genuine life balance. Burnout hides an intricate machinery fueled by unspoken needs and relentless inner critics. When overwork goes unchecked, the body and mind transform strain into a persistent ache, a deep weariness that robs enthusiasm and clouds clarity. It's not simply tiredness, but a psychological and physical breakdown, signaling that the balance of forces within the psyche has collapsed. At the core lies the conflict between surviving on willpower alone and the neglected demands of the pleasure principle. The ego, fixated on fulfilling endless duties, pushes cognition and emotion beyond normal limits. Initially, adrenaline and cortisol elevation maintain high energy, creating a false sense of invincibility and reinforcing the overwork pattern. But this hyperarousal taxes systems, speeding exhaustion and triggering the body's alarm. The suppressed needs are mute cries, the need for rest, meaningful connection, creative freedom, and self-compassion. Instead of honoring these needs, the ego silences them, rationalizing that sacrifices are necessary for success and survival. This denial intensifies internal tension and fragments emotional regulation. The mind oscillates between numbness and irritability, between foggy disinterest and bursts of anxiety or despair. This torment often manifests physically: muscle tightness, headaches, digestive issues, bodily symptoms encoding psychological distress. The psychosomatic feedback loop deepens as pain drains mental resilience and undermines sleep quality. Insomnia becomes a vicious companion, fueling further mood swings, poor concentration, and impaired decision-making. The pleasure principle's voice, long stifled, demandingly seeks release through any means: impulsive eating, narcotics, or withdrawal into escapist fantasies. Perfectionism compounds burnout's engine. The internalized superego demands flawlessness and ceaseless productivity, harshly judging any slip as moral failure. This unforgiving inner tribunal ignites guilt at rest or play, making relaxation feel illicit. The ego's attempt to meet oppressive expectations triggers chronic effort, even when resources are depleted. Habits harden. Workaholism becomes defense and offense against feelings of inadequacy. Social disconnection magnifies the burden. Burnout isolates, as overwhelmed minds recoil from relationships to conserve energy. Yet social support is critical for buffering stress and fostering pleasure principle fulfillment. Loneliness intensifies suffering, creating a psychic pressure cooker where irritability and resentment simmer beneath the surface, eroding empathy and satisfaction. Understanding burnout's machinery reveals it as more than exhaustion. It's a disorder of psychic energy misallocation. The mind clings to destructive cycles: push harder, rest less, please others at cost to self. Recognizing suppressed needs as vital signals instead of weaknesses initiates transformation. Reallocating energy to meet pleasure principle demands through meaningful leisure, creative expression, and self-care resets the system. Importantly, healing begins with self-compassion, softening the harsh superego judge. Compassion allows the ego to embrace imperfection and vulnerability as natural facets of human life, reducing guilt and fostering authentic well-being. Mindfulness meditation teaches detachment from destructive self-criticism, creating spaciousness to respond rather than react to stress. Therapeutic interventions often focus on dismantling perfectionism and cultivating balance. Cognitive behavioral techniques accompany psychoanalytic insight, helping reframe maladaptive beliefs about worth and productivity. Treatments encourage setting realistic goals, pacing effort, and incorporating restorative routines as essential performance enhancers rather than indulgences. Embodied approaches reconnect mind and body, recognizing that physical wellness profoundly influences mental states. Practices like yoga, breathing exercises, and somatic therapies release stored tension and support relaxation responses. Diet and sleep hygiene reinforce biological resilience, stabilizing the stress system and restoring harmony between the pleasure and reality principles. Ultimately, burnout signals an unmet psychic dialogue. When the ego listens and negotiates with the pleasure principle, burnout's machinery slows, allowing renewed vitality and productivity. Re-establishing this dialogue is not a one-time fix, but an ongoing process of attunement, self-awareness, and deliberate self-care that reclaims human wholeness amid life's demands. The roots of overwork and burnout often trace back to childhood dynamics and the unconscious scripts formed during early development. Freud's psychosexual stages highlight how fixations at different points in youth shape adult patterns of behavior, especially regarding control, achievement, and self-worth. These early imprints become the blueprint for how one relates to responsibility and pleasure, deeply influencing tendencies toward compulsive work. In the oral stage, where gratification centers on nurturing and dependency, unresolved struggles may lead to adults who seek reassurance by overcommitting, using work as a way to compensate for unmet emotional needs. The compulsive hustle thus masks a yearning for security and approval that was never fully satisfied in infancy. This insatiable drive fuels chronic overwork as a substitution for the comfort that remains elusive. The anal stage, with its focus on control and autonomy, often creates two contrasting adult prototypes when fixations remain unresolved: the meticulous perfectionist and the rebellious procrastinator. A childhood environment that imposed rigid standards for cleanliness or obedience may imprint an anal retentive personality, as Freud described, characterized by organization and an unyielding inner critic. Such individuals pursue flawless achievement, but risk burnout from the impossibility of sustaining perfection. Conversely, those who experienced conflict over autonomy may develop anal expulsive traits, resulting in chaotic work habits and difficulty adhering to schedules. Though both patterns share an underlying struggle with control, phallic stage fixations involve identity, competition, and recognition. Adults with unresolved conflicts here may overwork to win approval or surpass rivals, fueled by unconscious desires to prove worthiness. This can manifest as relentless ambition or fear of failure, with a persistent inner tension to assert superiority or avoid humiliation. The performance arena becomes a replay stage for early struggles with parental figures, intensifying the pressure to achieve. The latency and genital stages further build on these foundations, incorporating socialization and mature relationships. Difficulties in these phases can fuel anxiety about acceptance and self-worth, sometimes leading to isolation and overcompensation through work. The adult's identity merges with productivity, overshadowing authentic pleasure and connection. Freud emphasized that defense mechanisms developed in childhood also play pivotal roles in how adults respond to stress and responsibility. For example, repression may bury unresolved anxieties about authority and achievement beneath conscious awareness, only to resurface as compulsive overwork. Rationalization justifies excessive effort as necessary, while denial ignores signals of burnout until crisis thresholds are crossed. Projection may externalize blame onto co-workers or institutions for pressures that originate within. Recognizing these unconscious patterns presents the first step toward change. Self-awareness practices help illuminate how early experiences continue to shape adult choices and emotional responses. Journaling about work habits, triggers for overcommitment, and internal dialogues can unearth the scripts driving compulsive toil. Identifying whether perfectionism, rebellion, or dependency underlies burnout clarifies targeted interventions. Psychoanalytic therapy or reflective partnerships aid in excavating these patterns beneath conscious layers. Exploring childhood memories, family dynamics, and relational histories reveals repeated themes that sustain overwork. This reflective process enables individuals to untangle identification with parental expectations from authentic self-definition, loosening the grip of inherited scripts. Another fruitful method mirrors Freud's technique of working through, actively confronting and revisiting internal conflicts rather than avoiding them. Behavioral experiments test assumptions about authority, competence, and self-worth, gradually dismantling unrealistic standards. For example, an individual might deliberately delegate tasks and observe that outcomes remain satisfactory, challenging fears of inadequacy. Symbolic work also facilitates healing. Creative expression, narrative rewriting, or role-play can enact corrective emotional experiences, reprogramming unconscious relational templates that demand overexertion. These new symbols foster greater flexibility and self-compassion. Establishing clearer emotional boundaries counters repetitive cycles of overwork fueled by internalized demands. Practicing assertiveness around limits, saying no, or negotiating expectations breaks the unconscious obedience to rigid authority figures from the past. Transitional objects or rituals provide emotional grounding during times of stress, offering stability outside of work identity. Sublimation channels intense drives into balanced outlets, redirecting perfectionistic or competitive energies into art, volunteering, or physical activity transforms pressure into creative vitality rather than exhaustion. Mindful awareness cultivates ongoing attention to bodily and emotional cues, strengthening self-regulation and preventing relapse into compulsive patterns. Finally, peer support and accountability circles create social scaffolding. Sharing struggles and progress around work-life boundaries encourages mutual reinforcement of healthier habits, countering isolation and shame. By illuminating how childhood fixations and defenses prime adult overwork, psychoanalytic insights empower individuals to rewrite their narratives. This foundational work grounds sustainable change, enabling a freer dance between responsibility and pleasure, past wounds, and present possibility. Freud's psychoanalytic method offers a profound framework for restoring life balance by addressing the unconscious forces that fuel burnout and overwork. Central to this approach is interrupting the repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to reenact familiar but unhealthy patterns rooted in early life experiences. Healing begins with bringing these patterns into conscious awareness, allowing individuals to make deliberate choices that contradict automatic destructive impulses. A key technique involves cultivating desire clarity. This entails differentiating genuine current needs from unconscious reenactment of past relational dynamics. By consciously compiling a relational wish list, individuals articulate authentic desires such as emotional availability, mutual respect, and dependable support, grounded in present values rather than old wounds. This list functions as a litmus test against which all new relationships or commitments are evaluated, weakening the magnetic pull of repetition compulsion and fostering healthier boundaries in work and life. Behavioral experiments form another cornerstone. They involve testing and gradually shifting habitual responses to stress and responsibility. For example, deliberately reducing hours spent on work without succumbing to anxiety challenges the internalized belief that worth is tied to exhaustion and output. These experiments revise the ego's expectations, empowering it to tolerate discomfort and embrace rest as essential rather than optional. Freud also emphasized the significance of working through unconscious conflicts by verbalizing and exploring them in safe, supportive contexts. Psychoanalytic therapy provides a structured setting for this work, but self-reflective journaling, creative arts, or conversation with trusted allies can also facilitate the process. Naming and narrating the burnout experience externalizes its power, gradually disarming compulsive cycles and enabling reframed meanings of achievement and self-worth. Developing self-compassion is vital within this framework. The harsh superego that demands unrelenting perfection is softened through techniques that cultivate kindness toward oneself, reducing guilt associated with rest or failure. Mindfulness meditation and compassionate self-dialogue practice foster an attitude of acceptance, enabling the ego to balance demands with genuine care for well-being. Integrating body awareness complements psychoanalytic insights. Somatic therapies help release tension and trauma stored physically, breaking the mind-body cycle of stress reinforcement. Practices such as breathing exercises, yoga, or movement therapies restore physiological regulation, making it easier to heed the pleasure principle's vital signals. Creating new rituals embeds these insights into daily life. Scheduled moments of pleasure and rest are treated as non-negotiable priorities, mirroring the discipline once reserved for work tasks. Such rituals recalibrate the ego's internal narrative, affirming that pleasure and responsibility coexist rather than conflict. Group support adds a critical layer of accountability and normalization. Sharing struggles and successes around boundaries and self-care diminishes isolation and shame, reinforcing commitment to healthier patterns. Psychoanalytic groups or peer communities become spaces for collective witnessing and validation, enhancing recovery. Finally, Freud's model encourages an ongoing process of self-exploration and renegotiation. Balance is not a fixed state, but a dynamic interplay of forces requiring continual attention to changing internal needs and external demands. As individuals learn to listen to both pleasure and reality principles with nuance and compassion, sustainable vitality and fulfillment emerge. Through these psychoanalytically informed practices, what once was a relentless push toward burnout evolves into a resilient dance of discipline and delight. The ego becomes a wise negotiator, honoring responsibilities without sacrificing the essential human need for restoration and joy. This renewal frames life as a richly textured experience, where achievement and pleasure are woven into a balanced tapestry of well-being.